All right, hello, welcome to um, the year 2010. This is your lesson video for the year 2010. Um, our goals are we want to explain the major events of the year 2010 and learn some of the key components to the Affordable Care Act, which was one of the bigger political events that happened in the year 2010. So let's get to it. All right, so when we talked about the year 2009, we talked about President Obama. That's where he first goes into office and is first inaugurated. And one of his key um, things that he wants to work on as president is healthcare reform. Healthcare reform we've talked about in the past. Specifically, we can go back to like Medicaid and Medicare with LBJ when he was in office, and um, we talked about how when President Clinton was in office, one of his big things that he wanted to do was pass a Universal Health Care Act. He put his wife Hillary Clinton, the first lady, in charge, and it was a massive failure, right? So fast forward now to the year 2010. You have a Democrat, President Obama, in office with both houses of Congress, the House of Representatives as well as the Senate, both with Democratic majorities in both houses. So this is like the ample opportunity for healthcare reform to happen. So uh, the Affordable Care Act was negotiated and talked about and discussed from 2009, and then finally in March 23rd, 2010, it's officially signed into law by President Obama. That's what he's doing here in this picture, signing that. The law was largely based on Mitt Romney's healthcare plan when he was governor of Massachusetts. Mitt Romney, a Republican, is actually going to run against Barack Obama in the 2012 election for president. So this was a plan that very different from like a universal healthcare type of plan that the Clintons were proposing. This was a plan that relied more heavily on insurance companies as well as government subsidies as opposed to being a complete full government style of healthcare. Um, the thought of the Obama administration was by doing this kind of like a middle ground type of plan and reform that would help get some Republicans on board to help pass it. That didn't happen. The law did pass, but it was purely on party lines. The Affordable Care Act received 0 Republican votes in both the House as well as the Senate. So not one single Republican voted to pass the Affordable Care Act. But when it did pass, Democrats had a big enough majority in both the House and the Senate. When it did pass, this was the first major health care bill that had been passed since LBJ's Great Society programs created Medicare and Medicaid. So this was seen, at least for Democrats, as being a really big landmark piece of legislation and a big key piece of Obama's time in office. So let's break down the Affordable Care Act and kind of what it changed and kind of what it's all about. Because we are still, to this day, under the Affordable Care Act as far as health insurance. So the Affordable Care Act was nicknamed Obamacare. It was that name Obamacare was kind of first used by Republicans in a negative way, and then President Obama kind of embraced it and kind of put his stamp on that name Obamacare. But it's a very long and complicated bill, so I'm just going to talk through some of the main features of it. So some of the big things that Obamacare did wasn't just in helping more people be covered, and I'll get to that part of it, but some of it was how it reformed the healthcare system and some of the changes it made. So First up, with the passage of the Affordable Care Act, insurance companies could no longer deny somebody coverage because of a pre-existing condition. So what that means is that, say you are uninsured, and you find out you have cancer. Cancer is something that's really expensive to treat. So under the old system, if that were the case, if you were to try to get insurance after you knew that you had cancer, insurance companies could deny you coverage. They could just choose not to cover you, because they know that you would be too expensive to them. So Obamacare put a stop to that. So now insurance companies cannot deny you coverage because of a pre-existing condition. Also, insurance companies could not drop your coverage when you are sick. Might sound like I'm sick right now. It's just really bad sinuses. Anyway, so if we stick with that cancer example, right? So say that you are covered under insurance, but in the old system, and you have cancer at a certain point after receiving some treatments, insurance companies, if you became too expensive for them to cover, could potentially drop you as a client. And the Affordable Care Act made that change, put a change to that. Also, another change, another reform to the insurance system was that women could not be charged more for insurance than men. That was a common practice under the old system. Women, because largely because they can have babies and so on and so forth, they tend to be more expensive to cover for insurance companies than men. Men also tend to go to the doctor less, so that's another factor. But now women could not be charged more for insurance than men. Also, preventative care would be free under the Affordable Care Act. So any type of like pre-checkup that you might get done for certain things would be you wouldn't be charged for. It also expanded Medicaid, to cover the poor. So if you were unable to afford any type of insurance premium, no matter how cost effective, if you hit, were in a certain threshold of poverty, you would be covered under Medicaid. That was expanded to cover more people that could not afford insurance. Also, if you worked for a company that had 50 or more full-time employees, those companies were required under the Affordable Care Act to provide insurance for their workers. So I'm not sure what the requirement for companies to insure their employees was before this, but most people do have insurance through their work or their spouse's work or their parents' work. So this just made smaller companies have to provide insurance to their full-time employees, more smaller companies. It also created a marketplace for subsidized insurance. So you could, if you weren't able to get insurance through your work, you could go to the Government Affordable Care Act website, apply for insurance through them, and if you, depending on your income level, you could potentially receive government subsidies, either covering all or part of your insurance premiums through the Affordable Care Act. It made another change to insurance in that young adults could now stay on their parents' insurance plan until they were 26. That had previously been you could stay insured under your parents as long as you were in college, and I think that cut off after like 4 or 5 years of college. So potentially till you were like 22 or so under the previous plan. So that expands. So that allowed more young people to be covered. Typically, especially in the old system, young adults in their early to mid 20s, if they weren't able to get insurance through their employer, most would not get insurance in that case. So this helped get more young people insured. And one of the key components of the Affordable Care Act was known as the individual mandate. Basically, what the individual mandate said is that if you do not have insurance, you have to pay a penalty. So basically, if you are uninsured, if you're not able to prove that you have insurance, you would have to pay a fine every year. And that was done through your taxes when you submitted your taxes every year. So if you were not insured, could not prove that you had insurance, you would pay a fine. So that was a way to try to get more people to get insurance as opposed to paying that fine for not having insurance. So as you can imagine, and what we mentioned when we talked about 2009, healthcare reform was a very politically polarizing debate. So because the Democrats were the ones driving this, President Obama and the democratically controlled Congress, if you were a Democrat or you leaned left a little bit, you most likely supported it. If you were a Republican or you leaned to the right side of the political spectrum, you most likely did not. That's just kind of how this played out. So I've laid out here on the screen some of the arguments for it and some of the arguments against it. We'll start with the for. So one of the big arguments for this was that there were too many people that were uninsured in the current or now previous system, right? The argument being that, as being one of the most, wealthy and powerful nations on the planet, we have amongst the highest uninsured rate for citizens. And those that argued for this were like, this would help get more and more people insured. Another argument for would be that it would drive down overall costs by drawing younger and healthier people into the insurance pool. So if you're not sure exactly how insurance works, like say it's similar to like car insurance or whatever, you pay into this pool, every month or whatever, and that money then is all collected from everybody that's in it and paying into it, and then it's distributed as needed to people, right? So the idea of getting more younger and healthier people into the insurance pool is that you'll get more people paying in, which means that helps people that need, usually younger, healthier people aren't going to the doctor as much and aren't getting as much treatment. So they're paying in, they're not necessarily getting paid out. So that puts more money in the pool to pay out those that that need more treatments and doctor's visits and so on and so forth. It also, another argument for was that it placed those new rules on insurance companies that I mentioned in the previous slide, like the pre-existing conditions and so on and so forth, and that those were needed. Also, that a similar plan to this was successful in the state of Massachusetts under Governor Romney at the time, and that most other advanced and industrial nations provide healthcare to their citizens, and that access to healthcare is a basic human right. Now, some of the arguments against. Some individuals could see their insurance, the cost of their insurance go up. Some might see that cost go up significantly. And nobody wants to pay more money for something that they already have, right? So that was a big key talking point, whether or not that would happen. Another argument against was that the government cannot require you to buy something that you don't want or need. So by having that individual mandate that you would be fined if you didn't have insurance, that's basically saying the government saying you must have health insurance. And those that argued against it said the government can't force you to buy something, to pay for something that you don't want for yourself. Another argument against was that it would raise taxes on those who make over $200,000 a year. Also, that the bill was too complicated and was passed along party lines. There was no middle ground. No Republicans supported that bill. Also, another argument against was that it increased regulations on insurers. which would result in many insurers leaving the marketplace, which would reduce options and drive up costs. And lastly, that small businesses cannot afford to pay for healthcare for their workers. So, kind of laying out there some of the major arguments for and some of the major arguments against. And again, there's more arguments for and against on each side. These were kind of the main talking points there. Before I move on, before I talk about what's on this slide here, the Affordable Care Act and the debates over it and everything involved in it is going to be one of the biggest political hotbed discussions. It started in 2009, definitely throughout 2010, and is going to continue through especially Obama's first term in office through 2012. It's going to be a major talking point. Republicans are going to use it to help rally their base. One of the things that we'll talk about soon is how Republicans were able to use that to make major wins in the midterm elections. Very, very politically polarizing was the Affordable Care Act. Okay, another major thing that happens in U.S. history in 2010 was the BP oil spill of the Deepwater Horizon oil rig. So this giant oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico, that drills down into the surface and pumps oil up through. Something happened. There was a major explosion, which caused major leakage of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. That explosion killed 11 workers and begins what becomes the worst oil spill in U.S. history. Oil leaked out into the Gulf of Mexico for 86 days before the leak was finally sealed. An estimated 4.9 million barrels of crude oil spilled into the Gulf of Mexico. Billions of dollars were spent on cleanup. Local industries were negatively affected. Think of local tourism, local fishing, so on and so forth. And a lot of questions came out of this. Is it safe to do this deep water offshore drilling? Should there be more safety regulations on these big oil rigs out there? And is the company BP, because they owned this oil rig, were they liable for or responsible for the cost of all of this cleanup and all of the effects that it would have on local industry and such? So those were some of the major questions that come out of this. You can see in this map down here. So this would be over here on the right. This is like the panhandle of Florida, and you can see New Orleans over here, and Alabama and Mississippi there. So those areas were greatly affected. Those Gulf Shore areas were greatly affected by this oil spill. Okay, and so when we talked about 2009, we talked about how Obama appointed Sonia Sotomayor to the Supreme Court, and she was confirmed by the Senate. He would have another opportunity in 2010 when Justice John Paul Stevens retired. He would then nominate Elena Kagan to fill that vacant spot on the Supreme Court. She was confirmed by the Senate vote of 63 to 37. And became the fourth woman Supreme Court justice. And for the first time, there are 3 women on the Supreme Court at one time. So pretty monumental for that. If you remember, 9 people sit on the Supreme Court at once. So 3 of those members at one time being women was pretty historic. And I when I talked about 2009, I said, look at these vote totals. You can see the 63 to 37 vote. It's a much closer vote total than Sonia Sotomayor had. So let's keep watching how those go as we talk about more Supreme Court vacancies being filled.
Okay, and another thing that happened in 2010 that was seen as a win for the Obama administration was putting an end to the "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" policy of gays in the military. If you remember, if we go back to the Clinton administration, "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" was a policy that he helped his administration put into place, basically saying that previously to "Don't Ask, Don't Tell," if you were gay, you were not allowed to serve in the military. They could ask you during recruitment, or if it was found out while you were already in, you would be dishonorably discharged. "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" was a slightly better solution to what was there before, meaning that if you were gay, you could serve in the military, but you weren't allowed to be like openly gay. So like that, you couldn't be asked, but still, if you were found out that you were gay, you could be dishonorably discharged. So it was like I said, slightly better than the policy that was in place before, but neither side was happy with "Don't Ask, Don't Tell." So during Obama's State of the Union address, he stated that he wanted to end that policy. The House passed a repeal bill that initially failed. Several state courts questioned the policy's constitutionality. And later in 2010, a repeal bill passed the House and the Senate, and President Obama officially signed that repeal bill, officially repealing "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" and allowing gays and lesbians to openly serve in the military. Okay, so coming into the 2010 midterm elections, remember, a midterm election is, these are congressional elections that happen at kind of the halfway point of presidency. That's why they're called midterm elections, right? And really, the reason that they're talked about so much is that it kind of gives a gauge of how the general public feels about the current administration. So in the 2010 midterm elections, Republicans made major gains. They actually, remember, going into these elections, Democrats controlled the House and the Senate. After these elections, Republicans gained control of the House by gaining 64 seats. That's a huge swing. Democrats did keep control of the Senate, but they lost their supermajority. The Republicans gained 6 seats. So, what a supermajority is you have to have, so there's 100 members of the Senate. Obviously you need 50 to have, or 51 to have a majority. If you have a supermajority, that means that you can pass things without them being filibustered or being stopped by the opposition. So you would need 60 members of one party in the Senate to have a supermajority. Democrats had that going into these elections, lost that. So they still had control, still had a majority, but did not have that supermajority that they had. This was the biggest Republican wins since 1938. And the Tea Party that we mentioned in 2009, they really helped energize the Republican base. Tea Party politicians and grassroots organizations really helped push the Republican agenda. This was the first major challenge that President Obama faced. And with Republicans getting control of the House, that means we're going to get a new Speaker of the House, which becomes this guy here. This is John Boehner, Republican representative from the state of Ohio. So he becomes the Speaker of the House, taking over that role that previously belonged to Nancy Pelosi. Okay, a huge Supreme Court case happened in 2010. It was called Citizens United versus the FEC, or Federal Election Commission. This decision had major effects on how campaigns are financed and was very, very controversial. One of the most controversial decisions in recent history. The case dealt with the constitutionality of regulating campaign spending by organizations. So the Supreme Court ruled on a 5-4 vote that freedom of speech that idea of freedom of speech guaranteed by the First Amendment prohibited the government from restricting independent political expenditures by corporations, labor unions, or other associations. What that means is the Supreme Court basically said in the case of political donations, money actually equals speech. So a corporation can, and corporations are also kind of representative of people. So since people can donate to political organizations, so could large corporations. And to hamper their ability, this was the court saying this, to hamper their ability to donate large sums of money would be limiting their speech. So that whole idea is very controversial, and has fundamentally changed how elections are run from this point forward. I believe Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote the dissenting opinion, so she disagreed with this decision. She would have been in that for. She said a democracy cannot function effectively when its constituent members believe laws are being bought and sold. So she's making the point that money is big, like corporate money is going to outweigh the will of the people. So this case, Citizens United, is often credited for the creation of what became known as super PACs. A PAC is a political action committee. They make no financial contributions to candidates or parties, so they can accept unlimited contributions. So it's kind of like a workaround. So these corporations aren't allowed to donate as much money as they want to an individual candidate or to an individual party, but they can donate as much money as they want to these political action committees. And those political action committees can then run ads and so on and so forth for those candidates or political parties. So it's kind of like a go around, if you will. And this case has fundamentally changed politics and elections. I'll have to find a new chart, a more updated chart for this, but you can see the amount of spending by super PACs after 2010 is when Citizens United came through, and you can see, how much money was spent. The reason, like you see this kind of up here in 2012 is because that was a presidential election year, so down a little bit more in the midterm election year, up again heavily in the presidential election year. But you can see so much more money being spent by corporations in elections. And some other key events of 2010. Republican Scott Brown wins the special election to fill Ted Kennedy's vacant Senate seat. This was a big deal because if you remember when I talked about the year 2009, Senator Ted Kennedy, longtime senator from his area, largely Democrats kind of controlled that area. He was a big in favor of healthcare reform, died before he could vote on it. Scott Brown, being a Republican, filling that seat was like seen as a big deal, a big win for Republicans, a big loss for Democrats. The U.S. Navy ended its ban on women serving duty in submarines, so women can now actively serve in submarines in the Navy. Arizona passed a controversial anti-illegal immigration law. Basically what this law did was allow officers, if they stop someone that they suspect might be an illegal immigrant, they're allowed to ask them to show their proof that they are a legal resident. Opponents of this bill said that it encouraged racial profiling. President Obama signs Dodd-Frank reforms into law. What those did those were reforms. This is Senator Chris Dodd and Senator Barney Frank here. Two longtime Democrats helped push through this legislation that would put more strict regulations on banks to help another great recession from happening again. So they put some regulations into place that helped keep banks from making such risky moves and loans with their money. And the war in Iraq comes to an end. The last combat troops leave Iraq, and the official end of the war is declared on August 31st. So one of those campaign promises that Obama made when he was running for election was that he would end the Iraq war, and that officially happens on August 31st, 2010. These are some of the people that died in 2010, those that we lost. Famous child actor Gary Coleman. Leslie Nielsen, made famous from the movie Airplane, great movie. Rue McClanahan, better known as Blanche from the Golden Girls. George Steinbrenner, longtime owner of the New York Yankees. Lena Headey, famous actress in the day. We actually, if you remember when we talked about the Harlem Renaissance, I showed a video of a musician by the name of Fats Waller. She was in that video, if you remember watching that. He was the guy with the eyebrows. And Corey Haim, another child actor, passed away in 2010. Okay, checkpoint questions. Which of these was not a part of the Affordable Care Act? Young adults can stay on their parents' insurance until age 18. It expanded Medicaid to cover the poor. Coverage cannot be denied because of a pre-existing condition, or the individual mandate. So if you looked at this and you said young adults can stay on their parents' insurance until age 18, that is correct. That was not a part of the Affordable Care Act. The big thing here is the age, 18. It was actually put at the age of 26. So that's why that one is wrong there. How did the Affordable Care Act pass Congress? With only Democrats' votes? With major Tea Party support? With both Democrat and Republican votes? Or with only Republican votes? And yes, with only Democrats' votes is the correct response here. Remember, 0 Republicans in the House and in the Senate voted for the Affordable Care Act. The Blank Party had its biggest wins in the 2010 midterm elections since 1938. Libertarian, Tea, Republican, or Democratic. And if you said Republican, you are correct. Remember, they had a big swing in the House and chipped away at the Democratic majority in the Senate. Last question. Which Supreme Court decision ruled that corporations can contribute an unlimited amount of money to political organizations as long as they do not directly contribute to a party or a candidate? Was that Brown versus the Board of Education, Miranda versus Arizona, Citizens United versus the FEC, or Schenck versus the United States? And we just talked about it. Citizens United versus the FEC. If you hear this talked about, it's usually just referred to as Citizens United. Okay, last thing I want to show is what I was up to in the year 2010. I graduated from Tiffin University with my teaching degree, so that's me here. Fellow people that were with me in the teaching program, Miss White is now in Canada teaching language arts. Mr. Higgins is now in Norwalk teaching some type of history, and Miss Camelo is in the Cleveland area teaching history as well, probably coaching soccer, last I saw. This is me and my niece Jenna. She is now a junior in high school, so very little back then. This is me and my pops. We went to the Indy 500. This is where we were at there. And that's me and my girlfriend at the time, wife currently. We were on a boat. So that was the year 2010 in a nutshell. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for watching.